And finally, our third section for this presentation, continuing chapter 5 from verses 12 to 21 now. It's the legacy of Christ, and it outweighs by far the legacy of Adam. Now, there's a little bit of a question by a few people that this section really belongs perhaps to another part of Romans or from somewhere else, and it's been brought in to fit in here. Joseph Fitzmyer says that because we're sort of suddenly moving from a description of life in the Spirit to a more generalised comparison of life under Christ versus life before Christ. And it's not as intimate, this section, as before, which is addressed to us, we. It's our life and so on. The first person plural. Now it's more impersonal. However, we shouldn't take too much notice of that. The opening words, sin entered the world through one man, and through sin, death. And thus death has spread through the whole human race because everyone has sinned. The real subject Paul wishes us to focus on is death, because it's going to be contrasted with what Christ offers us, life. We see this when we look a bit further down this passage at verse 17. If it's certain that death reigned over everyone as a consequence of one man's fall, it's even more certain that one man, Jesus Christ, will cause everyone to reign in life, who receives the free gift he does not deserve of being made righteous. The major contrast Paul is making is between Adam's legacy of death, Christ's legacy of life. Now, if we go back to the Jewish tradition behind Paul's contrast, Adam was held responsible for the fact that we've got to die. And this goes right back, in a sense, to Genesis chapter 3, which was, of course, something read and known by all Jewish people because it's from the books of Moses, see. In the story of the fall, in chapter 3, verse 19, we read, "With sweat on your brow shall you eat your bread, until you return to the soil from which you were taken. For dust you are, and unto dust you shall return." There's a fourth book of Ezra, and this is what we read in this. "You, God, laid upon him," Adam, "one commandment of yours, but he transgressed it, and immediately you appointed death for him and for his descendants." Now, to understand that, it's really mythical. This is going back and understanding we weren't really meant to die when God created us. As the book of Wisdom, chapter 2 says, God didn't make man perishable. He made him in the image of his own nature, imperishable. Death wasn't part of the Creator's design at all. Now, of course, you and I would look upon death as natural and so on. And in a sense, that's true for the time of Paul. But in a big mythological way or theological way of looking at it, it was seen as death as a punishment for sin. Now, another very, very important point. Since the wonderful St. Augustine, the focus on these opening verses of this section hasn't been so much on death and the contrast with life, but on sin. Because the opening words are, sin entered the world through one man. So Augustine started to theorise on what this original sin might be and how it was transmitted from one generation to the next, beginning with Adam and Eve. And so Romans 5, verses 12 to 14, becomes, in Western theology, the locus classicus, the starting point, if you like, for the doctrine of original sin in the whole of the Catholic Western Church. Of course, in the 16th century, this was one of the main points of issue between Lutherans and Catholics. Exactly how much damage does original sin do to us? Lutherans were far more pessimistic than Catholics, as later in the Catholic tradition were the Jansenists. Both Lutherans and Jansenists and Calvinists would say, we can't do anything without God's grace. And they're following a rather strict interpretation of Augustine's understanding of this passage. But if we're to read Paul a bit more closely, we can see that Paul doesn't really speak of how Adam's sin is transmitted, nor about what effects that has for our minds and our hearts, as the later theologians speculated in that area upon. He does say, almost personifying sin, as well as personifying death, that human beings have been deeply affected, even infected, by Adam's sin in some way, and we're in the thrall of sin, or under the spell of sin in some way. But there was no Jewish doctrine of original sin, and Paul himself doesn't really teach it, even though we would say that what he's saying here in this passage is quite seminal for later theological reflection. Adam prefigured the one to come, Jesus. But, he says, the gift itself considerably outweighs the fall. So Adam is like Jesus, but only because they're figures of great universal significance. But Jesus far outweighs Adam. Jerusalem Bible, I've just read the translation for you. The gift considerably outweighs the fall. The only similarity is that they have universal significance. But what Jesus is for us is far more significant than what Adam ever did by sinning. Look at what Paul says. If it's certain that death reigned over everyone as the consequence of one man's fall, it's even more certain that one man, Jesus Christ, will cause everyone to reign in life, who receives the free gift he doesn't deserve of being made righteous. And to leave you with a comment of Brendan Byrne, Adam was simply a human being where one evil act had fatal repercussions. Behind the act of Christ stands the overflowing power and generosity and love of our Creator. So what Paul is clearly saying to us here is something vital for the way we live our lives. Grace is always much more powerful than sin. And this profound truth seized the heart of Paul. And it's this that he's sharing with us. And this is an essential part of the good news that we try to live. We never focus on our sins without focusing on God's far more powerful, far more important love and grace in our lives.